This happened last week, and while she didn't seem malicious, the things she said were creepy. I was going home from university, and to get home I have to use the train. As I got on, a lot of the seats were occupied. In my country, the seats are put in a way so that four people can talk and sit in front of each other, and they're kind of close, perfect for talking, even with strangers, sadly. I see that there's a free space in front of this girl, who's 1 or 2 years younger than me, but you can never know. I go there and ask her if I can sit down. Of course, she replied, and looked at me in a strange, intense way. I pulled out my phone to distract myself from her. She also had a chocolate in her hand. Keep that in mind. She asked me, "Where do you live?" And I was like, "Why do you have to know?" So she asked when I'm gonna get off the train. I told her the place and she told me that she's getting off at the next one. She started singing, then said, "Oh, sometimes I sing. I'm a silly girl." Then did it again. Whenever she said something, she looked at me like she was waiting for a response. So I replied, "It's okay to be silly," because I just didn't want to talk to her. Then she told me that, "You are pretty." And when I asked what, she asked if she's pretty. In my language, the second one is an extension of the first, so it seemed like she corrected herself. Then she asked if she had chocolate on her face. She did. I also had the chocolate in her hand offered to me, but I declined. She also told me about her piercing that came off, and she put it on in the middle of the train. I told her that she should fix it when she got off, and she said, "In Germany, will you go there with me?" But obviously I told her no. While she tried to put her piercing back in her mouth, she told me that she's in love with me. I told her that I have a girlfriend. I didn't. And that the pacing is too fast for me. And she told me that she will beat my girlfriend. Her "I love you" started escalating into "I'll kidnap you" and strip for me. She asked me if I will go with her, and if she could go home with me. Then, when the train arrived at my destination, she asked me, "Are you going, love?" I told her yes, and went on my way. Luckily, she didn't follow me home. She also asked me when we were going to meet again. And hopefully, that's never. I met this girl, Elle, on an online chat room and hit it off with her. She was literally everything I ever wanted in a woman. Except for one thing. Elle lived in Portugal, over 3,500 miles away from where I lived in the US. We got close though, despite the distance, and decided we wanted to make a go of it. And so we entered into this long-distance relationship. A few months later, I got a new better-paying job, planning to use the extra funds to save up for meeting Elle in person one day. Instead, I met this girl, Alice, at my new job. We worked in a factory where you would work on two-person teams on a single machine. The teams would vary, so one day you would be working with person X on machine 4, and the next with person Y on machine 2. I'd been with the company for a couple of weeks and got assigned to work with her, and for the most part we got along fine. We made idle mundane conversation as we worked, as one does, talking about nothing serious, when out of the blue she asked me if I was single. I responded that I was not, and that I'd been dating this girl Elle for a few months, and left it at that. Thinking I put the kibosh on whatever she was thinking may happen between us. The conversation went on mundane as ever when she mentioned her boyfriend, and I thought that maybe she didn't have any ideas about anything after all, and was just being nosy. Our shift ended, and as such, so did the conversation. Over the next little while, we worked together again on and off, and at one point she asked me if she could add me on social media, and I said sure, not thinking much of it. That is until the next day at work, when she mentioned some post she read on Elle's wall that I hadn't seen or couldn't find. I asked her where she'd seen it, and she said it was an older post. The post was from 7 years previous. I asked Alice if she'd gone through Elle's entire history, and she said yeah, that she was bored and had nothing else to do. So after going through mine, she went through Elle's as well. That kind of set off alarm bells in my head, because who goes through an entire post history of a complete stranger in a single night? I guess my face showed my thoughts, because she quickly apologized and stated that she didn't mean to be so over the top about it. But we post so rarely that she would go through just a few and suddenly find herself looking at years-old posts. This wasn't untrue and seemed reasonable, but still weird, as she had no connection whatsoever to Elle, and so had no business on her timeline. I mentioned it to Elle later that day and helped her adjust her privacy settings so it couldn't happen again. A little while later on, and I was working with Alice again, and the conversation was again fairly mundane, when all of a sudden this guy walked over to our machine and just stood there glaring at us. First her for a while, then me, then back at her, and over again. After about 20 minutes, there was a call over the intercom, and he sauntered off to answer it. Alice looked like she was about to cry after that, and it was fairly creepy. So I asked her what that was all about. Turns out, that guy was her boyfriend, and they'd just broken up. I made the mistake of asking if she was okay, just trying to be polite while secretly hoping she wouldn't go into detail about it. Which, of course, she unfortunately did. As it so happens, he'd repeatedly told her from day one that after a bitter divorce, he wasn't interested in a monogamous relationship, that he wanted something open, no strings attached, no commitments, and no exceptions. She confided in me that she did want those things, and just went along with them since she could see his potential as a husband from day one, just like she could me. There went those alarm bells again. Anyways, he was apparently serious about wanting an open relationship, because he'd gone behind her back and signed them up for a swingers weekend a couple of cities over. When she'd found out, she said no, and that she wasn't ready for that yet, but agreed to have sex with a guy her boyfriend knew while he watched, after he dropped it into conversation, how he'd just helped a woman down the street move in, and that there was definitely a spark. And when the day came for her show with a stranger and she backed out at the last minute, he got pissed, called the whole thing off, and went and slept with a woman down the street. They ended up getting into a huge fight, and he broke things off with her for not being honest about what she wanted in the relationship. She then told me, "I just got so nervous thinking about a complete stranger doing that to me. I'm just not that type of person, and there's very few guys I would let do that to me. Present company included, of course." I cringed at that last remark, and reminded her that I was seeing someone for almost a year at that point. A comment she basically ignored. I got the impression at this point that in her head, just because me and Elle hadn't yet met in person, that meant our relationship was somehow less real. She also told how they'd slept together a few times since then, but she knew he was only coming around whenever the other girl was busy or didn't want to do it with him. She also told me that he'd been doing that to her any time they worked the same shifts. He would just show up and glare at her until someone called him, and had been doing this for almost a month. I told her that she should just report him to the supervisors, and she decided she couldn't. So I told her she should find a new job. She told me she couldn't, because at her previous place of employment, a popular national chain sandwich shop, she'd stolen large amounts from the till, and only avoided prosecution because she made restitution. And because of her criminal record, no other place would hire her. And there went that alarm again. Over the next few months, things got worse. She would randomly walk up to me at work and start talking about how we'd be great together, and how she always wanted a boyfriend like me who was kind, thoughtful, a great listener, tall, handsome, yada yada yada. I would always cut her off with a short but succinct, not to mention spoken for, and she would storm off. Alice would get all excited when we had to work together and post something along the lines of "working with Jace today, how I love this man," and tag me in the post, then delete it before I could see it, but not before Elle did, who eventually saved a screenshot and sent it to me when I confronted Alice with it. She basically blew me off, saying that it wasn't a big deal. I unfriended her and blocked her after this. Still, she would often walk up to me or tell me when we were working together about her favorite positions and how much she apparently loves going down for no reason. Like sitting on the couch watching a movie and then just doing it, and other extremely explicit stuff. Now, I'd been in the Navy prior to this, so the content of those comments didn't bother me so much as I'd heard much worse from the mouths of the US Navy sailors. What did bother me though, was if someone heard these incredibly one-sided conversations and said something to Elle, how much trouble I'd be in with a woman I'd grown to deeply care for. Not that there was much threat of that actually happening. I always told Elle whatever Alice would say to me, but it needed to stop. So I went to my direct supervisor and asked him to not put me working with Alice anymore, as there were issues there. I didn't go into detail, as I didn't want her to lose her job, but I did say that I was uncomfortable working with her. That's when things got really creepy. She started texting me, and when I asked her how she got my number, she ignored the question. I changed my number, and a few days later she was texting me at my new number. I changed it again, and within a few days she was sending me texts again. I didn't keep the texts, and to this day I have no idea how she was getting the numbers, and her texts were responses to in-person conversations I've had with other people. At one point, her friend and I were working 12-hour shifts, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., and I'd said something about how I was going to just order a pizza when I got home and grab a shower while I waited the 30+ minutes for the delivery guy. I got a text from her that night, saying she'd overheard that I was getting pizza, and suggested that I bring the pizza by her place so we could hang out, and another immediately after, saying that when I got to her place, I would have to be naked. And blocked the number, only to get another message from her the next day from a different number. This one was a picture message of her in nothing but 3 slices of strategically placed pizza, telling me to pick which topping I'd like to eat first. In another instance, I was texting a friend about heading to the mall that weekend to pick up a birthday present for a mutual friend and set up a pickup time and such. To the mall, as she was going to Victoria's Secret to get some new lingerie. I needed someone to help her in and out of the lingerie as she tried it on. I got an email later that weekend that was a series of pictures from her in various states of undress as she modeled her new lingerie for the camera. That week at work, I requested to be put on the weekend shifts permanently, as she worked the morning weekday shifts, and that would mean I would only have to see her once during the week and not have to work with her. Alice's response to seeing me less was to start showing up in places I was. I went to a small party store in town where I could get a hard-to-find flavor and brand of soda I liked, and as I walked up to the register, Alice was suddenly there, just standing in the doorway. I paid for my sodas, and then just kind of stood there. I didn't want to call the police or get myself tied up with legal issues, since I was planning to travel to Europe to spend some time with Elle, and I also didn't want to go home as I was afraid she would follow me there, and then know where I lived. So I just stood there looking at her, not really sure what to do. When suddenly she just turned around and left without a word or purchasing anything. She showed up one night at my favorite burger place, a little hole-in-the-wall bar, and sat down at my table right across from me and had the call to ask me if I was going to buy her dinner. I moved to the bar where I stayed until the bar closed at 3 a.m. and then some. The barkeep was a friend who gave me a lift home. I caught her following me around a major chain superstore late at night, and when I finally shook her and was able to go home, I got pictures sent to me of her touching herself in the pharmacy department. How she got away with that one, I'll never know. Unfortunately at this point, Elle's mother was diagnosed with final-stage colon cancer, and she died less than 2 weeks later. Feeling like I really needed to be there for Elle, I got my documentation in order, bought a plane ticket, and put in my 2 weeks' notice. I saw Alice twice more in my regular spots in the coming weeks, as I prepared to depart for a 3-month stay to help Elle with anything she may need. Once outside my bank when I stopped to shift some funds around for my trip, and the other as I was getting some new socks and underwear and the like for the trip. She walked up and recommended what she would like to see me in, before slithering away. A couple of weeks later, I was sitting in the airport terminal waiting for my plane, and I got texts from her asking if I was ready to man up and finish her off in bed a couple of times. I shook my head and ignored it. 3 months later, I was back in the States, just in time for the 4th of July. I didn't see Alice all summer, nor did I give her much thought. Elle came to visit at the end of September, and in November, we got married after being together and traveling back and forth for 3 years. Later that month, my hometown was holding their annual Christmas tree lighting ceremony, and Elle had never been to one before and wanted to go. So we went. While we were standing there singing Christmas carols, me rather off-key, I felt these arms wrap around me from behind and clasp at my waist. Initially, thinking it was Elle, I put my hand on hers about the same time I realized that Elle was standing next to me, so she couldn't be the one wrapped around me, nor were these hands wearing her engagement or wedding ring. I pulled the person's hands away and twirled around, coming face to face with who else? Alice. She'd spotted me in the crowd and decided to say hi with some guy in tow. Elle turned around and Alice spotted her, and I could see Arkham Asylum flash across her face. And I saw her take the hot cocoa away from the guy with her, and I pulled Elle slightly behind me as Alice lowered the cup as if to throw it over Elle. I asked her who her date was, and she froze and looked at him, and then quickly said he wasn't her date, just a friend. This seemed like news to him as he got angry and stormed away. I watched him go, and when I turned back to Alice, she was sizing up Elle, so I asked Elle if she could get me a cup of that cocoa. Elle left, and Alice asked, "So, still dating her, eh?" I responded, "No. We're married now." Alice froze, looked me dead in the eye, and recited my address, described the layout of my bedroom in extensive detail, and promised that she would show me what real Americans did to Eurotrash before she ran off into the dark night. Al and I stayed at my parents' house the last few days we were there. I called the cops, but nothing ever came of it. I also called my former landlord and told him he should be on the lookout for someone trying to break into the empty apartment. At the end of November, we got on a plane bound for Portugal and left Alice behind. Me and Al now have a baby named after Al's mother. I feel bad for whoever Alice latches onto next, but I'm glad there's a whole ocean between us now. And Alice, if you're out there and you're reading this, please, for the love of God and all that is holy, let's not meet again. So this happened years ago when I was a dumb teen who loved walking the city alone after dark. This took place in Eastern Europe, for context, in a city with a tramway system. On this night, I sat in a tram station, waiting to catch the last tram home. 3 trams stopped at this station, 2 of which went where I was going. Remember this for later. It was around 10 p.m., and as I sat there waiting, lost in thought, I barely registered a man quietly walking up and standing by the shelter. I thought nothing of it, just someone else waiting for the tram, until I started feeling weird. The streets were quiet and dark, and there was no one else in sight, just me and this guy. And I started wondering why he chose to stand this close to me when he had so much space to avoid dealing with people. I couldn't comprehend anyone wanting to socialize this late at night, given that I was not very social myself. So I glanced at him, trying not to overthink it. He was a bald-headed, beady-eyed giant, tall and built like a bear, big belly and big arms and legs. I was 5 feet 2 inches and scrawny, but that wasn't what scared me. It was the fact that he was staring right at me, unblinking and expressionless, not even attempting to look away or act embarrassed. No, this guy wanted me to feel uncomfortable. I instantly felt weak and shaky, cold shivers down my spine. This was not normal. I realized quickly that I was not in a good situation. I couldn't miss the last tram. Walking home was out of the question, and my phone was almost dead. I was a shy kid, and didn't have what it takes to scare this guy away. I knew that, but I had to at least try. I only managed to order a small "Hi," trying my best to startle him out of what he was thinking, but my attempt failed in the face of his silent, threatening aura. He kept staring, no sign of intent to reply. He was enjoying this. Feeling the panic rising inside of me, I told myself to stay calm and think rationally. Maybe he didn't hear me. Minutes passed. His stare continued to burn on my skin, and there was no tram in sight. Ignoring him didn't work, so I mustered the courage to speak once again, this time louder. "What do you want?" "Stop staring." No answer. He definitely heard me this time. I felt myself start to get angry. I didn't want to let this guy get to me anymore. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of watching me squirm nervously and pretend that this behavior didn't bother me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to start thinking. I knew what I couldn't do. I couldn't fight him off if he made a move, and there's nothing I can say or do that will get him to stop. I didn't know what his intentions were, but I knew they weren't good. If I tried to walk away, he would probably follow. I could run, but he would most likely catch up to me before I could tire him out, since his legs were much longer than mine. Even if I managed to somehow lose him, walking home past the junkies that were always prowling about could land me in an even worse situation. I could pretend to call someone, but he might feel compelled to act much sooner if he felt threatened. So, what could I do? The only thing I could realistically do was to try and outsmart him somehow. So I started developing a few plans depending on which tram showed up, trying to confirm whether he was just amusing himself and actually waiting for a tram too, or popped over for the other, more suspicious reasons, and whether I could get any kind of help. I couldn't let him see where I lived, so if he followed me, I'd have to be prepared to employ whatever strategy available. And for that, I needed to stay rational and aware of my surroundings. While I was still thinking, the first tram showed up. It was one I could have taken home, but this one pulled into the depot right in my neighborhood, forcing me to lead him to my home. I hoped he would board it and leave me be, but he didn't. He kept watching me carefully. I let the tram go, desperately hoping it wasn't the last one, to head home. He continued to watch, and I sensed that he was quite happy with how things were going. I put up with it for another 15 minutes, trying to focus on another plan of action. I could now pretend that I needed the other tram, the one going to a different area of the city, and just right to the next station, getting off as soon as possible so I don't end up too far and miss the tram I need. This tram showed up next. With my heart in my throat, I boarded it and sat down by the door. He got on it too, but sat himself in the back, pretty far from where I was. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking this might still go well. When the tram reached the next station, I got up and out, not looking back and hoping it was all over. But when I stepped on the pavement and watched the tram drive away, I couldn't see him. I turned my head slowly and was terrified to see him walking towards me, looking slightly pissed off. He stopped just a few steps away and resumed staring, this time with a clear hint of malice, still in silence. My vision blurred as I fought back tears of despair. He was not going to let me go. The helplessness I felt was unbearable, but I couldn't cry, I couldn't give up, I had to find a way, I had to get home tonight. The prospect of what might happen to me any time now, if I didn't, was becoming too real. My head was full of unanswered questions, regrets, and horrible scenarios. I wanted so badly to not have to think anymore, to not have to fight back the tears and stay composed. But I knew this would be his cue to enact whatever fucked up plan he had in mind. I couldn't let that happen. Then, I saw the final tram approach. The only one I could take now, and got on it as quickly as my trembling legs would allow me to. When I was in, bright lights enveloping me. My mind snapped out of its nightmarish spiral of fear, and allowed me a moment of clarity. I had 3 stops to figure this out. I sat down at the front and looked at the driver. He was a frail old man, blissfully unaware of my distress. Getting the driver's attention was a no-go. We passed 1 stop. There was no one else waiting to climb aboard. I turned around, fully expecting to see that the psycho had followed me again, but I did not expect him to be sitting right behind me. He was not taking any chances. He was making sure I didn't try anything like the last time. I shot him a hateful glare and allowed my anger to overcome my fear. I stood up and purposely walked over to another seat, in the middle of the tram car. I wanted to make it clear I would not put up with this bullshit any longer. He got up too, and slowly walked up to a spot, 2 seats behind and diagonally from me, then sat down with the tiniest arrogant grin on his face. Already expecting it. I shot up and stood by the middle door instead, determined to keep him on his toes. If I stood right by the door, he won't have any idea which station I planned to get off at. He remained where he was this time, convinced that I was bluffing. After all, this was really the last tram. There was nothing else I could possibly do to escape now, he must have thought. So my defiance was just a funny act to him. This was my chance. I had to take the risk. It had to work. There were 3 doors on the tram, and they all opened and closed at the same time, and stayed open for around 5 seconds before closing again if no buttons were pressed or people detected on the threshold. The next stop, the only one left before mine, came into view. The tram slowed to a stop, the doors opened, and I made no move. 5 long seconds passed, the door started to close. I bolted out and ran for it, reaching the back door as fast as I could, and slamming the button to open it again. My whole body tense with adrenaline. I waited a long, painful second and jumped back in, keeping my head low, holding my breath, and crouching behind the nearest seat. I shut my eyes tightly and exhaled slowly, while thanking the gods I didn't believe in for that button working, and wishing with all my might for him to not have seen me before I got back in. As I was waiting to hear his footsteps approaching, I pictured him frantically looking for me. Was he still on the tram? Face screwed up in anger, head turning like a fat, ugly meerkat. Or was he catching his breath on the pavement of the last station, mad eyes searching the darkness for me? As the tram continued its loud journey, banging and clanging in sync with my heartbeat, I dared smile to myself, imagining his face when he realized he fucked up. Hand on my chest, I did my best to stealthily look around the corner and found no one looking back. I stood up in excitement and threw myself at the foggy back window. There he was, standing alone and victimless on that slowly fading out of sight station, watching me leave him and his vile plans behind. Giving someone the middle finger never felt so good. I made it home and told no one my story, for fear I'd be admonished for my naivety. But I was safe. I was proud of myself and I learned my lesson. Creepy stranger, I hope the events of that day taught you not to underestimate girls and prevented you becoming a criminal for the rest of your life. Let's never meet again. For the past 4 years or so, my husband and I have been trying to avoid our dog stalker. This may sound silly, but she's an elderly woman who lives in our condo community. We were thinking she must be in her 70s or so. It first started very innocently, with her walking up to us when we were out on a walk with our dog, but she wouldn't speak a word to us, even when we addressed her with a friendly hello or asked how she was doing. She would only speak to our dog and talk to him or ask him questions without even the slightest acknowledgement of our existence. She would carry bags of, I hope, dog food with her and would try to put a large handful of it up to his mouth as soon as she got close enough to him. We got to the point where we started saying no thank you when she would try to do this, but she would not acknowledge what we were saying, let alone our presence. Who knows what she carries in those baggies? And she would never answer us when we asked. After a while, we started taking alternate routes, or we would slip onto a different pathway upon seeing her. There have been moments where she noticed us do this, and she begins to yell our dog's name to get his attention, and will start walking toward our general direction. About a year into her fixation with our dog, we started hearing knocks at our door at all hours of the day and night. But by the time we would get up to see who it was, they were gone. We live in an enclosed community with indoor building access to our front door, so we rarely have issues with solicitors, and never have issues with ding-dong ditching. We started to become annoyed, as this knocking seemed to happen at random times, so we could not narrow it down to who it could be or plan to stake out the mystery knocker. Then, one day, the knocking started to become accompanied by someone yelling our dog's name, along with, "Come open the door, I want to play with you." Upon hearing the familiar voice, we realized who it was. How the hell she found out what unit we lived in we will never know, as the community has roughly upwards of 150 units, and she was never quick enough movement-wise to successfully follow us home. The knocking has seemed to calm down over the past year, but she still stands out in the common courtyard with a baggie in hand, waiting for us to walk out of our building. To the lady who continues to stalk my dog, let's not meet again. Back when I lived in the rural Midwest, I lived in a house right off of the highway. My house was right between one town and another, almost right on the county line. Our house had a big circle driveway. If you drove in the driveway, you would be going straight towards our barn. If you curved right, you could pull into our garage. If you went past the garage, you could circle around, in front of the house, and pull back out to where you started. Our house had 2 large double doors in the front, which we rarely used. We always used the door that was inside the garage. One night, it was very late. My doorbell rang. My husband, my 3-year-old daughter, and I were all asleep. It woke me up, and I thought maybe I was dreaming. It rang again. I woke my husband up. He thought I was hearing things until it rang again. It was very dark outside, but we have a dusk to dawn light, so most of the driveway is pretty lit up. Unfortunately, you can't really see the front door unless you open the door and look out. You can open just one at a time, or you can open them both by using 2 latch-like things that are at the top and bottom of one of the doors. My husband gets up, and I follow him. He decides he's going to open the door. I want to call the cops, but because we live on the country line, we know it's going to be a while before they can get there. He opens the door to a girl, maybe early 20s. She looks normal, except for the fact that she's standing at my door in the middle of the night. I look past her, and her car is pulled up into my driveway just off of the road. Not up to the house. Not around the circle. She says she needs to use the phone. She says her car battery died or something. She's not sure, but she can't get it to start. I told my husband, no fucking way. This is how horror movies start, and we offered to call the cops. She asks over and over, but I'm not letting her in. We tell her we will call, and she kind of stomps off. We watch her walk back to the car, maybe 50 feet away. I can see her car. I can see her. I call the cops. They say they'll be there as soon as they can. About 15 minutes. They don't sound very concerned, and at this point, I'm not really either. I mean, it's just a girl. She probably does have a dead battery. She opens the trunk. No lights come on. She rummages around in the trunk. Then the driver's side door opens. Out steps a guy. Then the back passenger door opens. Out steps one more guy. They all rummage around the trunk, no lights on. I can't hear anything. I can't hear them talking, and I can't tell what they're doing. They all get back in the car. Now at this point, maybe 5 minutes have gone by, and I'm silently praying that the sheriff puts his foot on the gas and gets here quick, but I know it's gonna be another 10 minutes or so. They just sit there, in the car. Lights off, not moving. I can't see them when they're in the car, but I know they're in there. I know they didn't get out of the car and walk past the house, because they would have to walk right under the dusk to dawn light. I would have seen them. I think I see the driver light a smoke, that part I'm not sure about. Then I see something. Someone walking towards the car from the right, coming from the direction of the barn. It's a man. I have no idea who this man is. We don't have a neighbor for at least a mile, and he's coming from the back of my property, which ends in the creek. He walks under the dusk to dawn light, straight to the car. He doesn't look at the house, he just walks to the car and gets in the back. The car starts up, and they slowly back out of my driveway and head north. The cops arrive about 10 minutes later, and at this point I'm freaking out. They search around, but can't find anything. They ask us if we got a license plate, but they were parked too far away. They tell us to call them again if they come back. Sure buddy, thanks. My husband goes and gets a shotgun from the shop, and we try to go back to sleep. They never came back. I don't know who those people were, and I don't know what they wanted, but Creepy people in a car without a dead battery.